It's in English, isn't it? Hello, good evening. Hi. Wow, we've got a full house. That's amazing. Thank you for coming. My name is Richard Ware. I'm the director of Institute Cervantes here in New York. And I'd like to thank you all for coming here on a not so chilly, such a chilly evening, but it's a great evening of poetry, charisma, and beautiful things that are going to crop up in this beautiful conversation we're going to have with specialists and, of course, with the one and only Homero. So it's tonight we're doing the celebrating the launching, the publication of the New Directions book called Self-Portrait in the Zone of Silence. I believe the book was written originally in Spanish in 2002, and it was translated this year, which is going to give us quite a lot of things. I was asking him right now in the background whether there was a lot of differences. Did he have to adapt anything between 2002 and 2023? Apparently not. So because I'm not an expert, I'm going to leave the specialists here to talk and discuss all these things. And we've got also some enacting of some of the poems. We also are joined by some of our usual suspects like Daniel Shapiro over here. I can see him. Hello, Daniel. And obviously, Ruben Gallo's just made it to the stage this minute. So with no further ado, I'm not going to rob you of any more time with the motley collection of specialists here. So please give them hands together for Homero Aridjis, which I've just learned this minute that it means maker of honey. And there you go. You live and learn. Okay, let's hear it for them. Thank you very much.
Good evening. Thank you, Richard. I'm Daniel Shapiro. And I wanted to thank Richard, Delia, and Rosalia, and Instituto Cervantes. And it's a special honor to be introducing Homero Aridjis tonight. World-renowned poet, novelist, essayist, the former president of PEN International, and former ambassador to the Netherlands, Switzerland, and UNESCO, and a globally respected environmentalist, just to name a few of his lauded roles over many years. He's the recipient of numerous prestigious awards for his literature and his activism. He founded the Group of 100, which dedicated itself to addressing environmental crises and protecting endangered species such as Mexico's sea turtles and monarch butterflies. I congratulate Homero on the publication of his latest poetry collection, Self-Portrait in the Zone of Silence, translated by George McWhirter and published by New Directions. It's an additional pleasure to acknowledge Ruben Gallo on the stage, and who's participating in this event with Homero. And Ruben serves on the editorial advisory board of Review, Literature and Arts of the Americas, the journal I edit via Routledge and CCNY's Department of Classical and Modern Languages and Literatures. This is a copy. There are display copies outside. I'll put my little plug in. This includes an essay by Homero, which I'll mention in a minute. I'm also additionally pleased to meet Michael Wiener, who's going to be reading Homero's poems in English. So congratulations, Homero, and all of you. Tonight is particularly meaningful given my long history with Homero through presentations of him in public events and through publication of his literature and commentary and reviews of his work in Review magazine. Homero was a featured author in Review 85, our Eco-Literature in Latin America issue, guest edited by Stephen White. And Homero contributed a moving personal essay in that issue called The Birds, which was eloquently translated by Betty Ferber, Homero's wife and literary collaborator. The essay details Homero's childhood accident with a shotgun in his native town of Contepec that marked a turning point for him toward his vocation as a poet, reinforced his reverence for nature, and likely was the seed of his lifelong dedication to environmentalism. This essay exemplifies Homero's poetic perspective and all it encompasses: the encounter of past and present, of chance and fate, a world of pure imagination, themes he returns to often in his poems. And to quote a title and a line from one of them, I always dream of some other place, of a Contepec that isn't Contepec, of a town that isn't on the maps. It's been my pleasure to publish additional prose as well as poetry by Homero in review, such as his mystical poem to Saint Teresa and his quote, I am an undocumented in eternity, unquote, both of which appear in this new collection. We've also published reviews of Homero's work in translation, including of his poetic memoir, The Child Poet, as well as his nonfiction work, News of the Earth, and a profile of him by scholar James Lopez. In addition to our professional relationship, it's been a true pleasure to occasionally spend time socially with Homero and Betty on their trips to New York, whether at a Chinese restaurant in Midtown or once at the Metropolitan Museum, where we talked about poetry and literature, of course, commiserated about current politics in and outside the U.S., and raised various toasts, including to my mother, who'd recently passed away. Since then, and especially during the pandemic, we've communicated over email between New York and Mexico City. In her missives, Betty would share news of Homero's latest articles and publications, and about their cherished daughters, Chloe and Eva, and their granddaughter, Josephine. And after the turn of the new year, through a family photo that enabled me to share with them, albeit vicariously, that intimate scene of unity and harmony. Once again, I congratulate Homero and George McWhirter and New Directions on this exciting and beautifully translated new collection. The poems employ striking, at times surrealistic imagery, exploring subjects and themes from the personal to the mystical to the political, addressing the mystery of life and death and the world of spirits, always precisely imagined with a child's wonder, reflecting his unique and expansive vision. And to quote the evocative final lines from an early poem in this moving collection, quote, the title of the poem is Meeting with My Father in an Orchard. And the lines are, then as if he has divined everything, he calls me by my childhood name and gives me a fig. So we met up, the living and the dead. Then each went on his way. Thank you. Congratulations.
Please use the microphones.
Sí. Ahora sí. Okay. El deseo de ser uno mismo, the desire to be oneself. I read it in Spanish and later we can read the translation into English. El deseo de ser uno mismo, desde Kafka. Si uno pudiera ser un jinete cabalgando a pelo sobre un caballo transparente, a través de vientos y de lluvias, constantemente sacudido por la velocidad de la cabalgadura. Si uno pudiera cabalgar intensamente hasta arrojar lejos de sí las ropas, porque no hacen falta las ropas, hasta deshacerse de las riendas, porque no hacen falta las riendas, hasta arrojar lejos de sí la sombra, porque no hace falta la sombra. Y así viera que el campo no es campo, sino puñado de aire. Si uno pudiera arrojar lejos de sí el caballo y cabalgar solo sobre sí mismo. Y aquí acabamos el poema. I'm sorry. Sí. Okay.
The desire to be oneself. After Kafka. If you could be a horseman riding bareback through the It's not working?
What?
All of them work. You just have to turn it on. This is on. You just have to turn it on.
Okay. The desire to be oneself, after Kafka. If you could be a horseman riding bareback through the winds and rains on a transparent horse, constantly buffeted by the velocity of your mount. If you could ride hard until your clothes were cast off far behind you, because there is no need of clothes. Until reins were done with, because there is no need of reins. Until your shadow was cast far behind you, because there's no need of a shadow. And then you might see countryside, not as countryside, but a fistful of air. If only you could cast the horse far behind you and ride on yourself.
Autorretrato con manos. La mano izquierda, sana, curiosa, pasa los dedos sobre la mano derecha, envuelta en gasas y en vendas. Su hermana está herida. Un disparo le ha volado las falanges y su niñez ha caído en la distancia. Sobreviviente de un accidente, él tiembla. Más que nunca, sus manos, animales prensiles de un mismo cuerpo. En el espacio hospitalario se reconocen como gemelas de la misma gracia y desgracia. Sentado el niño que tuvo una experiencia cercana a la muerte, convaleciente, se sienta en un banco cerca de la puerta verde, por la que sacan a los muertos, mientras ve a sus manos reconocerse como si no hubiera pasado nada.
Okay, we went in a different order. Okay.
Entonces, okay, so we have to coordinate. Okay, go.
Self-portrait with hands. The healthy, curious left hand runs its fingers over the right hand, swathed in gauze and bandages. Its sibling is wounded. A shot has ripped through the phalanx bones, and his childhood has fallen into the distance. Survivor of an accident, he shivers. More than ever, his hands, prehensile animals of one and the same body, in the hospital space, recognize each other as twins of the same blighting and blessing. The boy, who had a near-death experience, seated, recovering on a bench, stays sitting by the green door, through which they take out the dead, while he sees his hands acknowledging one another as if nothing happened. No, it's I was dream.
Title of La Muerte Madrina is coming like an story by the Green Brothers that had a lot of influence. Okay. We go on on with the la muerte madrina, the godmother, and this is a story by the brothers Grimm that had a lot of influence on me when I was a child, the apparition of this character. La muerte madrina. Los azules del frío apenas se movieron cuando entró la Virgen de la Luz por la ventana de la pieza gris del hospital de Toluca. El niño herido en el vientre había resucitado después de 3 días de morir en el camastro helado. A sus padres, que lo abrazaron, no les dijo que venía de dar un paseo por la muerte madrina, por una cueva subterránea donde ardían millones de cirios. Grandes, pequeños y medianos, todos se consumían intensa, tenuemente, cada llama representando la duración de una vida. Al mirar que unos se apagaban y otros se encendían, le pregunté a la muerte, ¿cuál es mi luz madrina? Esa, tu momento no ha llegado todavía, dijo y desapareció por la ventana. Y desde entonces, cada momento de vida fue un regalo de la divinidad.
Godmother Death. The blues of the cold barely moved when the Virgin of Light came in, through the window to the gray ward in the Toluca hospital. The boy, wounded in the belly, had resuscitated after 3 days of being dead in the ice-cold, rickety bed. He said nothing to his parents, who hugged him, about how he came to take a walk with Godmother Death through a subterranean cave where millions of candles were lit. Big, small, medium, all burning intensely, tenuously. Each flame represented the duration of a life. On seeing that some went out and others were lit, I asked Death, "Which light is mine, Godmother?" "That one. Its moment has not yet come," she said, and disappeared through the window. And from then on, every moment in life was a gift from the divinity.
Okay, and maybe this is a good time to intersperse a little bit of a conversation with Homero, because it's such a special occasion to have the poet, to have the reading in Spanish, and then the translation in English. So, Homero, I wanted to ask you, in these poems, childhood is very present as a theme, and it might be useful for the audience if you could say a little bit about your childhood in Michoacán, which is very strange. So could you talk about the world you grew up in and the references that appear in these poems to that world of Michoacán in the 1940s, 1950s? Mm-hmm.
Well, these poems really are a little autobiographical, because when I was 10, I suffered an accident playing with a gun in the house of my childhood. And I survived because they call it a miracle, because in the village there were no doctors, and I survived like 8 hours going to the next city and in a car. Then I survived 8 hours without medical attention. And when I arrived, almost I died in the plancha, in the doctors survived. And I died a few days because I was unconscious. And when my parents saw me alive, they look at me if I was un resucitado. Then it was like that, and I came back to the village, but my life changed. I began to read books and almost to write. It was like a providential accident. And I used to say until now that the accident was a present, a gift of the divinity.
And we should add that Contepec in Michoacán was a very small village. It's still a very small village, very far from Mexico City, very far from the center of literature, and very close to nature.
Exactly. Like Ruben says, this village is very small, that sometimes I used to say that Contepec was so small, that was bigger than New York and Paris and Mexico City. And the people say, why? And I said, because it began and end in the air, in the sky, because it was so small, that was the whole sky. And this village was very close to me, because was also the village where every year came the monarch butterflies. The migration from Canada to across Mexico and came to the village, and they spent a few weeks, months there. And for me, when I was a child, I used to go to the hill where the monarch butterflies were flying, and also they were flying across the streets of the village. Then I grew up very close to nature, especially linked to the monarch butterfly. And I didn't know, but I certainly knew why. When I became an environmentalist, one of my first targets, my first purposes was to save the monarch butterfly sanctuaries, because the deforestation that were destroying the hills around my village. And I got the official decree to protect the monarch butterfly sanctuaries in '85, when I was one of my first activities in the group of 100, that was the environmental group that my wife Betty and me founded in '85.
And let's go back to Contepec. So you were a little boy, you had this accident, you were in bed for a long time, you began to read, you began to write. How old were you when you first went to Mexico City?
Well, I used to go with my father every time, because my father had a business and he used to go to Mexico City to buy goods, to sell, etc. And I had a brother, a student, medicine in Mexico City. It was not far away of Mexico City. As a matter of fact, was one of the big cities closer to the village. It was on the other side of the hill, the other side of the cerro, they said it, and I was very close to Mexico City. Yes.
And when you moved to Mexico City, you met this very interesting group of writers who were active in the city, and they were experimenting with all sorts of new forms of poetry. There was something called the Beat Generation in Mexico City, and you entered this world that was very different from Contepec.
Yes, well, one of the friends, because I was very precocious, there were two writers at the time, or three. There was one, Juan Rulfo, he published the Plane in Flames, and Pedro Páramo. There was another writer, Juan José Arriola, who had a workshop for young writers, and I became friend of them because I was a chess player, and Arriola was playing with me chess. And I was very good, and I was beating Arriola every time. And because from revanche to revanche, he became a friend. Because he saw me, my presence in his house was chess. And immediately he became so fanatic to play with me but I was very good player at the time. I was 10, 11, etc. And the other was Juan Rulfo. Juan Rulfo didn't play chess, but he arrived to meet young writers in the house of Arriola because he had workshops. And Rulfo was very neurotic, and he said to me, don't be a friend of Arriola. He's golfo, he's a vago. Come with me to the cantina. I teach you how to become a man. And I said, Juan, I don't want to be a drunkard, un borracho. I prefer to play chess. But we became friends. But many times, as a matter of fact, after meeting him, I met him in the street, but he was completely drunk, and he fell in the street. And I have to say, Juan, get up. Go home. And that was the meeting con Rulfo. Rulfo was always very drunk, but very good writer. He was one of the best writers in the country, in the 50s and early 60s. And that was my beginning meeting with that. Later came the beatniks, but they came from San Francisco, and they were living in Mexico City. But they were very friendly to me, but I was afraid of them because they said you were with them, and they said, do you want to smoke? And I said, a cigarette. No, it wasn't pot, marijuana. And they were with drugs already. I have to be careful with them, but they were very friendly. Most of them came from San Francisco, a few from New York, but especially San Francisco. They were, I had many of them. There was Lakewood for Kerouac, Lamantia, and others who were exiled, arrested in Mexico, like William S. Burroughs. But I didn't meet him because he was really serious. It's very serious.
And in this book of your recent poetry, there are several poems that paint that Mexico City of the 60s with all of these writers, these very eccentric poets running around. Could you read us one of the poems that's called, let me just find it.
Page 94, I think.
El poeta beatífico. Mira, aquí está.
Yes, the poeta beatifico was really Philip Lamantia. Was living in the street Rio Hudson, and he was living with a French artist. And when I met him, he published a book called Ecstasies, that was his experiences with drugs and more or less related to poetry. El poeta beatífico. I think of you, land of wire, my house of water on the hill. No, en español. I'm sorry. Okay, bueno. El poeta beatífico. Apareció una noche en un café de la Alameda. Los árboles estaban deshojados. Acababa de pasar el presidente de la República camino a Los Pinos, al frente de una caravana de vehículos blindados y de motociclistas con gafas de sol. El poeta beatífico se volvió con sorpresa para ver esos vampiros solemnes salidos del templo mayor. I'm sorry. De los sacrificios humanos de México, Tenochtitlan, pues esos Dráculas conspiraban seguramente para robar a los poetas su palabra y su éxtasis. De una palidez lunar, no por enfermedad, sino por el desvelo exigido por el verso y por los efectos de las drogas fumadas, ingeridas y untadas, el poeta conseguía sus trances en la pirámide del sol y la montaña solar. No veía la eternidad en un grano de arena, como Blake, ni hablaba con los ángeles en las calles de Londres, como Swedenborg. buscaba la iluminación en un plato roto y en la penumbra de un cuarto en la calle de Oslo. Una noche, en compañía de jóvenes que venían del norte buscando lo beatífico, subió a la torre de Televicentro, que convertía a los hombres en cerdos mentales, y desde arriba orinó la lluvia del coraje sobre sus estrellas y sus policías que lo miraban desde la banqueta. El poeta beatífico se casó con una mujer que hablaba la lengua de Rimbaud, pero no su poesía, en la pequeña iglesia de Santa María, con un vestido azul y un collar de perlas falsas. Su viaje de bodas fue un paseo por un maizal con un paraguas negro para protegerse del sol. 2 individuos de la policía de narcóticos robaron su éxtasis un mediodía, que lo detuvieron afuera de la oficina de Wells Fargo y le decomisaron el cuerpo del delito, unos poemas, y en la cárcel para extranjeros lo encerraron con ampones y guerrilleros cubanos. Retratado de frente y de perfil, fue deportado. Los jueces sobornables, pero no sobornados por él, le preguntaron en la cárcel migratoria: apellido y nombre, Philip Lamantia; procedencia, San Francisco; oficio, poeta beatífico.
Poet beatific. Is this working? Is this on? I think of you, land of ware, my house of water on the hill, my dreams and naked crowd. Philip Lamantia, ecstasis. He showed up one night at a cafe on the Alameda. The trees were leafless. The President of the Republic had just passed on his way to Los Pinos, leading a motorcade of bulletproof cars and motorcyclists in sunglasses. The poet beatific turned with surprise to see those solemn vampires straight out of the Templo Mayor for human sacrifices in Mexico, Tenochtitlan. Well, those Draculas certainly were plotting to rob the poets of their word and their ecstasies. With his lunar pallor, not out of any sickness, but from the late-night vigil's verse demands, and the effect of the drugs, smoked, ingested, and anointed. The poet brought on his trances on the pyramid of the sun and the solar mountain. He saw no extremities in a grain of sand, like Blake, nor conversed with angels on the streets of London, like Swedenborg. He sought enlightenment off a cracked plate and in the penumbras of a room on Oslo Street. One night, in the company of youngsters who came from up north on a quest for the beatific, he scaled the Televicentro Tower, which turned men into mindless swine, and from up there hissed a rain of anger on its star performers and the security police, who peered up at him from the sidewalk. In the little church of Santa Maria, in a blue dress and string of fake pearls, a woman who spoke the language of Rimbaud, but not his poetry, married the poet beatific. Their honeymoon trip was a walk in a cornfield under a black umbrella to ward off the sun. 2 individuals from the drug squad stole his ecstasis one noontime when they detained him outside the Wells Fargo office, confiscated the corpus delicti, a couple of poems, and locked him up in the jail for foreigners with thugs and guerrilla fighters from Cuba. Photographed front and side, he was deported. The bribable judges, though not bribed by him, asked him in the immigration prison, surname and first name, Philip Lamantia. Place of origin, San Francisco. Occupation, poet beatific.
El ajedrez.
Now we're going to hear another poem from that era in Mexico City about a chess player, which you mentioned. Could you just say a few words about this poem?
Yes,
How did it-
the chess player in dreams. Well, at this time came chess players to play in Mexico City, and because I was a chess player, many times I met them. There came chess players from the Soviet Union and Volqueres and other champions, and I play in simultaneous because my quality of game was not the level for play with them tete-a-tete, but it was like that. Then Juan Jose Arreola was like, the writer was like my manager. He wanted me to become a chess player, a professional. I refused because I didn't want to be in championship and being exhausted playing like against 20 to 30 chess players, and there was no time for me to write. El ajedrecista en sueños. Se había declarado vencido en todos los juegos jugados y por jugar, los que había contendido despierto y dormido contra los campeones y contra su propia sombra en un estado prenatal, laboral y larval. Pintadas las paredes de su cuarto color marfil, el sueño de la vida parecía tallado con este material. Y el cuerpo de la mujer y de la muerte eran escaques blancos y negros de huesos marfilinos. Lo aturdía el mariposeo de los mirones que venían a observar su desgracia lúdica, porque le daban jaque mate en sueños y aún antes de mover el peón 4 rey. En las aperturas y las variantes jugadas con piezas rotas, cojas y derrumbadas, visibles e invisibles, que seguían moviéndose en las sombras, él, perdedor consuetudinario, perdía todos los juegos. Movimientos ciegos conducían a sus derrotas. El mundo era un inmenso tablero de ajedrez donde el hombre perdía la partida antes de comenzar el juego. Y apasionado se extraviaba en el laberinto del amor y el análisis. Con un rey decapitado en la mano, semejante al fantasma de una pulga de Blake, el ajedrecista movía a solas piezas en la noche, hasta que cayó en la ficción de su propia muerte en la caja de madera.
The chess player in dreams. He had declared himself beaten in all games played and yet to play. In those he had contested asleep or awake, with champions and with his own shadow, in a prenatal, working, and larval state. The walls of his room were painted ivory. Life's dream appeared to be shaped with this material. And the body of the woman and of death, black and white squares of ivorine bone. The fluttering of onlookers, who came to observe his disgrace play out, unnerved him, for they checkmated him in dreams, even before moving the pawn to King 4. In the openings and variations played with chipped pieces, hobbled and toppled the visible and invisible, which kept on moving in the shadows, he, habitual loser, lost every game. Blind moves led to his defeats. The world was an immense chessboard where men lost the content before the game began, and, impassioned, strayed in the maze of love and the analysis. with a headless king in hand, akin to Blake's Spectre of the Flea. The chess player, alone in the night, moved pieces until he fell into a fiction of his own death in the wooden box.
So, Homero, another theme that appears in many of these new poems is a reflection on your family. You know, various people who you grew up with, your father, your mother, other people from Contepec. Tell us a little bit about the Aridjis family, which it's a name that's not Mexican, it comes from Greece. So tell us about your father, someone who emigrated from Smyrna. And tell us about this very unlikely voyage that took him from basically what was there, Turkey, to a small town in Michoacán in Mexico.
Well, as a matter of fact, my father came from Smyrna. He was a survivor of the war against the Turks. He survived many massacres. And the last one was when Smyrna was in flames. And for me, my father was the only foreigner in the village, because when he came to Mexico, he met my mother coming from Contepec to Mexico City, and almost they immediately married. And my father was a person that never wanted to leave the village. It was very strange. And in these circumstances was like the Leonora Carrington husband, who came from Hungary and arrived to Mexico, and Leonora Carrington husband never wanted to leave Mexico City, and later even didn't want to leave the street and the house. It became like almost a panic to leave this territory in Mexico City, in La Colonia Roma. And my father never wanted to go to any place. He went, when I was a child, to Mexico City, because he was had a tienda de ropa. He had bought and had land in the village. And one of the walks with him was to see the land. He was very happy with this village, full of very sunny, with hills, and there were his walks, and I walked with him many times in this village. I wrote about in El Poeta Niño, the child poet, and it was very strange, but he never wanted to go back to Europe, never.
One time you told me a great story. You said you asked your father, why did you come from Smyrna to Contepec? And
Yes.
he said,
Yes, well, was my mother, because when he arrived to Mexico City, my mother was a tourist from Contepec, and they met, and after 2 weeks they married, and he was rooted to the village, and he was Donisius, my father's name was Nikias, and all the peasants knew his name, because he was the only Greek in the village. And then he called me Homero. He was his name given by the root Greek. I was the only son of a Greek in this area called Homero.
and earlier you once published a poem about an aunt you had called Hermione.
Yes, exactly. I had an aunt called Hermione that she was lost her way, migrating from Greece to Holland, because after the war they moved to Holland, and she was lost 1 year between Greece and Holland, and nobody knew what happened. She just arrived one day after to be a year lost in Europe.
Okay, so could you read us one of the poems about your father in this collection, Meeting My Father in the Orchard?
Yes. this poem is very important because I used to walk with my father to the orchard, and I was used to see these fruit trees and cutting with him figs. And for me, the figs were like fruit communicating with him. And I was used to eat figs all the time. Yes. Encuentro con mi padre en la huerta. Pasado el mediodía, pasado el cine, con sus altos muros pesarosos, a punto de venirse abajo, entro a la huerta. Terminada la función, todos se han ido. Los peones, los perros y las puertas. Delante de una figura, delante de una higuera, mi padre está parado. Mi madre ha muerto. Los hijos han envejecido. Él está solo y lillos de aire atraviesan sus ropas harapientas. Por miedo a acercarme y asustarlo con mi presencia viva, quiero pasar de largo. Él pregunta al extraño, ahora con pelo blanco, ¿quién anda allí? Padre, soy tu hijo. ¿Sabe tu madre que has regresado? ¿Vas a quedarte a comer? Padre, desde hace años tu esposa descansa junto a ti en el cementerio del pueblo. Entonces, como si adivinara todo, él me llama por mi nombre de niño y me da un higo. Así nos encontramos los vivos y los muertos. Luego, cada quien siguió su camino.
Meeting with my father in the orchard. Past noon. Past the cinema with the tall, sorrowful walls on the point of coming down. I enter the orchard. Show over. All of them have gone. Day laborers, dogs, and doors. My father is standing in front of a fig tree. My mother has died. The children grown old. He's alone. Small threads of air weave in and out of his tattered clothes. For fear of getting too close and startling him with my living presence, I want to go straight by. The stranger now with white hair, whom he asks, "Who's that there?" "Father, it's me, your son." "Does your mother know you're back? Will you stay and eat?" "Father, for years now your wife has lain at rest by your side in the town graveyard." Then, as if he has divined everything, he calls me by my childhood name and gives me a fig. So we met up, the living and the dead. Then, each went on his way.
And Homero, even though your father was Greek, your mother was from Michoacán, and another theme in your poetry and in your writing in general is pre-Columbian Mexico and the ancient traditions that you saw in Michoacán, but that one can see in Mexico City. There's one poem which refers to this, which is La violencia comenzó con los dioses. The violence began with the gods.
I am this poem, The Violence Began with the Gods. This poem, The Violence Began with the Gods, is for me has been like a leitmotif along my life, because it's the mythology of Mexico, is life and death, but always you try to see the beautiful side of the Mexican paradise, the Mexican landscape, and so always you meet with death. And for me, as a child living in the village, I was used sometimes to see peasants coming to the store of my father with a gun, putting the gun against him. And he was very calm, said, somebody, Luis, you are drunk, go to sleep, take a nap, and here is a few pesos and buy a beer and go. And my father was very calm after the war with the Turks. The Mexicans were like lambs. And then he didn't react, said, go to cafe, take a nap, etc. Mexicans were very nice to him. But the violence in Mexico began with the gods. I have been attracted to this mythology of death. And as a matter of fact, I describe human sacrifices to make the new fire in ¿cómo se llama el pecho? The breast of captive. And I was fascinated by these ceremonies of death, and always reading about the most beautiful landscapes, situations, episodes of life. In Mexico, you meet death. And was sometimes for me, when I was a child, the transformation, sometimes in the village, of very peaceful people to the minor provocation, they become another person. They like in a film by Luis Buñuel, when the character is in a bar and with his nephew, and suddenly he has some, ¿cómo se llama? Migajas, como de crumbs, thrown by somebody in the bar against his head, and he doesn't pay attention. But there is another and another, until he has to show to his nephew that he goes to tell the person who is throwing, the man who is throwing to him this aggression, goes to the man, and he stands before the man and says nothing, and to the man, because he is provoking, offending him, and he comes back to the table with his nephew, and the nephew says to him, what happened? You went to stop him, this aggression, and you stood before him, and you said nothing. And the man said, because I saw death in his eyes. That's all. And that is sometimes happened to me when I met very peaceful people in the village. Suddenly the transformation of this very quiet person, friendly person, to a very violent character. And I was fascinated by this as a child, because I said, what happened? And it has been for me sometimes the mystery of Mexican character. This kind of transformation of very quiet people to very violent ones. La violencia. La violencia en México comenzó con los dioses. Antes de que hubiera ciudades y templos, ya había desmembrados, desollados y decapitados en los ritos del alba. El painal, sicario de nuestro señor Huitzilopochtli, ya descendía de los cerros con un corazón humeante en las manos.
The violence in Mexico began with the gods. The violence in Mexico began with the gods. Before there were cities and temples, there were quarterings, flayings, and beheadings. In the rites at dawn, The penal, executioner for our Lord Huitzilopochtli, was already descending from the hills, a smoking heart cupped in his hands.
Homero, I'd like to ask about another theme that appears in the book, which relates to your work in ecology, in environmental protection. And there are many poems in this new collection that have to do with nature, with Mexican nature, and with the destruction and impairment of Mexican nature. Could you tell us a bit, back in the 80s, you founded an organization that was called the Group of 100, El Grupo de los 100. Could you tell us what led you to found what was the first ecological association in Mexico?
Well, it was a passion for nature, most to say because I grew up in this small village surrounded by mountains and green fields. I grew up in the middle of nature. And when I saw the destruction around me, the pollution in Mexico City, living in Mexico City, that is a solar city, and suddenly you don't see the city because pollution, and you see people sick, dying because pollution. I wanted to do something, and the thing I thought, the best thing was all the writers and artists who felt like me to come together and to write something against pollution. And I call many, Juan Rulfo, Octavio Paz, the painter Francisco Toledo, archaeologists like Matos Moctezuma, very different fields, Leonora Carrington, and all of them agreed to sign a manifesto against pollution. And for my surprise, the reaction of the government and people was unanimous. We were dying because pollution. And I became like at the front of this movement of environmental. And not only that, I went to poetry festivals in Europe and in different places, and I was heading the movement for the environment. And still now, as far as I know, and making denunciations of this kind of situations that the pollution was killing people, children. And for me, it's something that became a question of life and death.
Could you read us The Creation of World by the Animals? La creación del mundo por los animales.
La creación del mundo por los animales is a very important poem because it came from the Popol Vuh, and it was this kind of brotherhood with life. And the creation was not other god, etc., but were the animals who create the world. I have to use my glasses. Yes. La creación del mundo por los animales, según el Popol Vuh. El cielo estaba vacío y sin movimiento, y la guacamaya escarlata fue un rayo de colores en la oscuridad uniforme. Y las oropéndolas de ojos de azul turquesa comenzaron a tocar en la mañana el solo de la luz. En la ceiba prodigiosa, madre de pájaros, apareció el esquelético mono araña, con sus genitales colgando junto al mono danzante, escribiendo en el espejo del alba mensajes sobre el tiempo por venir, y el búho lunar emperchado en el brazo de la muerte. A la orilla de un río acechó el caimán con bandas celestes sobre el lomo. Corrió el jaguar de dientes encarnizados tras el venado en fuga. El águila de alas translúcidas en vuelo vislumbró el horizonte y todo fue un sueño de plumajes verdes y amarillos. Entonces el cuerpo del hombre y el cuerpo de la mujer fueron formados de barro y agua y de madera. Hijos del bosque, del sol y la montaña, tuvieron ojos para mirarse a sí mismos y voz para nombrar a los animales. El corazón del cielo, el corazón de la tierra, el corazón del mar fueron una misma cosa, y todas las criaturas de la tierra, del agua y del aire pudieron llevar una sombra, respirar, ser y amar, y la creación se hace cada día.
The creation of the world by the animals, according to the Popol Vuh. Across an empty darkness, across unmoving sky, flashed scarlet macaw. So day broke, and yellow orioles with turquoise eyes began dancing a solo of light. And within a mighty ceiba tree, the mother of birds appeared, a skinny spider monkey, his privates dangling, and howler monkey, ascribing prophecies on the mirror of dawn, and a lunar owl perched on death's arm. Cayman lurked on a riverbank, his back marked with celestial stripes, and sharp-fanged jaguar pursued the fleeing deer, and eagle, aloft on clear wings, spied the horizon, and all was a feathered dream, yellow and green. Then figured from water, clay, and wood, came woman and man, offspring of the sun, children of forest and mountain. With their eyes they could behold themselves. Their voices named the animals. Heart of the sky, heart of the sea, heart of the earth, beat as one. And all the winged creatures, creatures of the waters and the land, could be, breathe, love, and cast shade. And life is recreated every day.
Homero, I'd like to ask you about one last theme that appears in the book, which is aging. You have several very beautiful poems. There's one about turning 80. There's several about something that happens to all of us, which is that we get old. Could you tell us, when did you begin to write poems that dealt with this theme of aging?
Well, because I am becoming old. That's the reason.
When-
And also, pardon?
When did you start becoming interested as a poet in
When
becoming
you
old?
see yourself in the mirror, or you learn about old age when you see the face of your friends also. Yes, when there is a child coming in the street and calls you señor, then even if you are like that, is the age is remembered by people you meet all the time, and also when you see a baby, and suddenly you see this baby looks very old. Probably he has been in the womb of his mother millenniums. But it's like it's enough to see, to go in the street, to go around to see the old age everywhere, and doesn't need to remember the myth of the Buddha. This death, old age, illness in the streets. Yes.
Yes, most of your poetry, since you started writing, you've always had a voice that's very youthful, and I think that's the beauty of your poetry. There's something very fresh, very young. In some points, it's almost a child's point of view that you adopt. Was it difficult to suddenly write about aging or turning 80? Did you feel like you had to change the voice?
No, it's life. It's enough to go in the street and to see your contemporaries. When I began, I understand old age is when I saw old age in the face of my friends. It was immediate, and it's inevitable.
Okay, could we hear The Ghost of a Dog?
Yes. This poem is dedicated to my dog called Rufus. Then it was my very, very good friend. The Ghost of a Dog. Lo vi venir corriendo por el aire en respuesta a la voz que lo llamaba en vida. Todo era luz en las praderas de la tarde, todo era ausencia en los cuerpos presentes en la calle. Su pelambre amarillo estaba descolorido, sus orejas negras transparentes. A mi lado ya no emitía los ruidos con que celebraba mi retorno después de las separaciones, ni corría de un lado a otro para festejarme. Jadeó su afecto y me extendió la pata. Yo atravesé su pecho con la mano. Yo acaricié su hocico inconsistente. Sus mandíbulas estaban desencajadas y sus ojos abiertos, ciegos. No sé a dónde se había ido desde aquella noche en que lo dejé dormido a la puerta de mi cuarto y al amanecer no lo encontré esperándome. Venía de un lugar donde no hay comida y para beber solo hay luz oscura. Y como a una sombra nadie lo había llamado por su nombre. Rápidamente nos reconocimos. Le puse la correa roja en el cuello y con la pata impalpable abrió la puerta. Era hora de su paseo y salimos a la calle, pero en la esquina nos desvanecimos. Esa questionality that my death is with him, or I feel my own death when he dies.
The Ghost of a Dog, for Rufus. I saw him come running in the air, to the voice that called him in life. Everything was light in the meadow of the afternoon. Everything in the bodies present in the street. An absence. His thick yellow fur was colorless, his black ears two transparencies. At my side, he emitted none of his sounds to hail my return after our times apart, nor did he dash from one side to the other to fet me. He panted his affection and offered me a paw. I passed a hand through his chest, stroked his filmy muzzle. His jaws were unjoined and open eyes, blind. I don't know where he went that night, after I left him asleep at my bedroom door and found him not waiting for me in the morning. From a place where there is no food and only dull light to drink, he came like a shadow. No one had called him by his name. Quickly, we recognized one another. I put his red lead on his neck, and with an impalpable paw, he pushed open the door. It was time for his walk, and out we went into the street, but vanished at the corner together.
Okay, and since time is running, why don't we finish with one last poem, which is the self-portrait in the zone of silence.
Okay,
Autobiografía en la zona de silencio, continuing with this theme of aging.
Yes. Well, as a matter of fact, la zona del silencio exists in Mexico. We visit because as an environmentalist, and it's in between the estados de Durango, Chihuahua, and it's a zone that is believed that is open to space. Local people said that probably Martians came, spirits came, and sometimes it's an area that you have to be careful because you can meet killers or thieves, etc. It's a strange area, and I visited I was writing a book called La Zona del Silencio, and I visited this area, and I went in the bridges and in the caves, etc., with Betty, who came with me, and we visited this area, La Zona del Silencio. Autorretrato en la zona del silencio. En la pared de la habitación había un espejo que reflejaba una hilarante calavera que se reía de sí misma, tejidas las mandíbulas con hilazas de muerte. Detrás de esa calavera había otra y otra. Nada rompía la secuela de la risa muda apoyada en la noche, excepto un rayo de luna. Yo, tras el sueño, tenía una palidez extrema, aunque me pintaba con el pigmento rojo relacionado con la sangre y el fuego, y con el escudo de Tezcatlipoca, el dios del espejo humeante, aquí lejos y allá cerca. El mediodía comenzaba a hervir, y entre las fauces y las garras poderosas del felino amarillo se quebraron los huesos de una cierva pequeña. Un espejo negro reflejaba la soledad de mi persona. Una verde negrura envolvía la silueta del dios de la dualidad, con medio rostro escarnado y un ojo por el que pasaba un tren vacío. La casa entre las dunas tenía una puerta que daba al infinito. En un nopal, corazones como tunas se secaban bajo un sol abrasador que no se ponía nunca. De cara a las estrellas, la hoja de una ventana se abría y se cerraba. En el crepúsculo, monos escribas danzaban y devoraban caritas sonrientes y flores negras. Mi perro Rufus corría bajo la luna, perseguido por su sombra. Entre dunas y ríos efímeros buscaba su resurrección. Nadie lo había buscado desde el día de su muerte. Yo tendría 40 años cuando esto ocurrió en el desierto. Los vientos del alma no tenían hora y por la oscuridad corrían a 100 kilómetros a la velocidad del olvido. Mis labios ardían y como el tequila, el deseo me provocaba violencia y lujuria sin razón. Así pues, cara a cara conmigo, tracé laberintos, ansiedades, arrugas, ojos y oídos, mandíbulas, pestañas, insectos interiores y exteriores habían entrado por el parabrisas sin vidrios de mi cuerpo, y en el vértigo de mí mismo estaba sola con mi mente. Entre sombrillas de un solo bastón y batientes movidos por el azar, imágenes desaforadas golpearon mi corazón, y desde el suelo remoto un perro con máscara humana me miró como si fuera un alter ego. Al pie de la pirámide doble de la vida y la muerte, el dios Quetzalcóatl ofrecía a sus seguidores flores y mariposas en lugar de carne humana, y entre tanto esplendor, solo la tristeza fue mía.
Self-portrait in the zone of silence. On the wall of a room, there was a mirror, reflecting back a comical skull that was laughing at itself. Jawbones knit together by the threads of death. Behind that skull, there was yet another and another. Nothing broke the impact of the voiceless laugh suspended in the night, except one ray of moonlight. I, in the after dream, was exceedingly pale, despite being painted with the red pigment related to blood and fire, and with the insignia of Tezcatlipoca, god of the smoking mirror. Noonday, there, close by, and here, afar, began to boil, and between the powerful jaws and claws of the yellow cat, the bones of a small doe were being crushed. A black mirror reflected my solitary person. A murky green enfolded the god of duality's silhouette. Half his face, fleshless, and an eye through which an empty train was passing. The house among the dunes had a door that opened onto the infinite. On a nopal, hearts were drying, like the prickly pears on the cactus, beneath a searing sun that never set. Facing starwards, a window pane was opening and closing. In the dusk, monkey scribes were dancing and devouring black flowers and little smiling faces. Chased by his own shadow, my dog Rufus was running under the moon. Between dunes and evanescent rivers, he searched for his resurrection. Since the day of his death, nobody had caught sight of him. I was 40 when this took place in the desert. The winds of the soul told no hour, and at the speed of forgetting, they ran through the darkness at 100 kilometers per hour. My lips burned, and like tequila, desire provoked violence and lust in me for no reason. So, face to face with myself, I traced my way through labyrinths, anxieties, wrinkles, eyes and ears, jawbones, eyelashes. Insects within and without had entered through the glass-free windshield of my body, and in the vertigo of myself, I was alone with my mind. Among sunshades on a single pole and windshield wipers moved by pure chance, outlandish images beat at my heart. And from the far-off ground, a dog with a human face watched me as if I were his alter ego. At the foot of life and death's double pyramid, the god Quetzalcoatl offered flowers and butterflies to his followers in place of human flesh. And amid such splendor, only the sadness was mine.
Okay, and do we have some time for questions from the audience? Yes? Okay, perfect. Yeah.
Whoever wants to talk to the mic.
So questions for Homero Aridjis.
No, I don't need the microphone.
Because we are
Oh, you're
streaming.
recording.
We are streaming and recording.
Oh, pardon.
Thank you.
Just briefly, Homero, because se no habla español, I was very impressed with your prosodía, and I would like to know, apart from the great poets of Western civilization, what do you think has influenced your prosody in the way that I hear the music? I understand the Latin words, but I hear the music. Could you comment?
Well, if there is music, it's my interior music because I feel the poem or the prosodia inside. And when I am ready, I write it. It comes from inside.
That's what I
Yes,
thought.
yes,
Wonderful.
yes.
Thank you so much. I wanted to ask about the role of family in your work. I noticed in the poem of your father in the orchard, but also, of course, in the return to childhood and in collaborations and translations. If you could speak to that, I don't know, generations or transmission as a kind of poetic project or part of your work. Thank you.
Well, I grew up, I was born, I grew up with a family very close. The figure of my father, who was a foreigner in the country, was an influence. My mother was a Mexican, had a very strong character, and she was liked to tell stories. And also in my actual family, I have my wife and daughters who have a lot of influence on me. And I am very open, the family, not in conventional ways, but in very deep, internal way.
Gracias. Don Homero, aunque nos conocimos hace muchos años, brevemente. Pero bueno, una pregunta que tengo que me parece interesante. Obviamente la presencia de la muerte en toda su obra es considerable, con múltiples dimensiones, y también pues llega hasta tal punto que dedicó una obra completa a la muerte, la novela La Santa Muerte. O sea que mi pregunta es, en todo este pensar en la muerte, en toda esta presencia de la muerte en su obra, ¿hay una dimensión por encima de lo poético, por encima de la imagen? ¿Hay una dimensión religiosa? ¿Hay una manifestación de fe religiosa? Y también, en definitiva, de un futuro tras de la muerte. O sea que esa sería mi pregunta.
Very brief translation. It's a question about death. Basically, Homero's work has addressed the theme of death for a very long time, notably a novel that's called Santa Muerte, the Holy Death. And the question is about the relationship between death and perhaps religion or transcendence.
Well, I must to say that since I was 10 years old, I had an accident. I was at the age of dying, and I came back practically from death, and I came back converted into a poet, expressing poetry, life, and I grew up in a village full of solar energy that when I was a teenager, I used to take off my clothes and to receive the sun, because the light in the village was so wonderful, and was the blue spaces where I enjoy very much the solar energy, and I am an adorador of the sun. Mexico is a country of the sun, even if it was a little bloody, because they were making human sacrifices to the sun. But I love the sun, and I enjoy very much the light. But death is very close, because I experiment death very almost. I was dying, and when I was a baby, I was in artificial box because my mother said that I was born very yellow. And just like that, then and visiting exactly the sanctuaries of the Santa Muerte in Mexico, the dead sun, there are in Tepito. I began to feel very attracted because the cult of the Santa Muerte in Mexico. And I went to this area called Tepito, that was, there are ladrones, criminals, etc. So I was attracted because these characters of Mexico underground, sometimes I saw a man with a very terrible face. And I said, I want to take a photo of this person because it's so horrible. But not because face, but because he looked so nasty, criminal. I said, I have to take it. And he looked at me and say, why he is taking my photo? And I said to him, because you look very interesting. Excuse me, and I took another photo. And he was becoming more annoyed. And I said, if you want, I take more photos of you. And he said, no, I go away, because probably he was a criminal. But like that, I was attracted, I don't know why. And I went many times to these ceremonies in the altars in Mexico City, in Tepito, of La Santa Muerte. And I published a book called La Santa Muerte. And the publisher said to me, where do you want to present the book? And I said, in Tepito, in the altar de la Santa Muerte. And the publicist said to me, are you sure? And I said, yes, but we have to go with you. And I said, yes, and we were there. And this woman, when she saw the people around, sorry, but Mr. Homero, but I would like to go away as soon as possible, because these people doesn't inspire me confianza. And I said, no, they are Mexicans, very popular people. Said, I know them. I don't know, but I don't want to meet them. And it was like that. It was strange, because suddenly a photographer said to me, I want to take a photo in the altar de la Santa Muerte. And I said, okay. And I was standing close to the window. And the photographer came and began to take photos of me with the image. And suddenly I said to myself, I have to go away, because with the flashes, this figure of the Santa Muerte was like animating. It was like movie. I said, like in the films of Frankenstein, with this the images, the descargas eléctricas begin to animate. And I said to stop, because it's becoming something terrible, terrible. And I said, there are things that it's better not to play with these things, because they mean some mysterious forces, extraordinary forces that you are not prepared and you don't know. And I walk away, because when you see the image of Holy Death, La Santa Muerte, in the neighborhood, surrounded by criminals, adoradores, real adoradores of the image, yes, I better I go away, because they are very serious criminals here.
Yeah, apparently we've run out of time, so please join me in thanking Homero and Michael for this evening.
Thank you very much for this very beautiful, special poetry night. Thank you, Homero. Thank you, Michael. Thank you, Ruben. And we would like to invite you all to go to our gallery and share a glass of wine and some book signing, so we have the opportunity to talk more and enjoy more of Homero presence here in New York. Thank you. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Can I take a picture of you three here? Okay. Yes, together.
Thank you. Sí, claro que sí. No, por favor, porque así tenemos para nuestro archivo foto de los tres.
Ahí están perfectos. Thank you, gracias.
Muy bonita noche, muchas gracias, de verdad. Muy bonita, muy bonitos los poemas. Thank you.
There's got to be a story with your wonderful book.
He did a very good moderation. Thank you, Rubén. Muy bien la moderación de Rubén también.